Daniel Carter wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked across the valley he called home. The twin suns of New Sonora were setting behind the red mountains, painting everything in shades of orange and purple. He had lived on this frontier world for 3 years now, and the loneliness had become like a heavy coat he wore every single day. His ranch sat in the middle of Crimson Flats, a wide valley where the red dirt stretched for miles in every direction. The thornbacks, his alien livestock, made their strange humming sounds as they settled down for the night in their pens. These creatures looked like a cross between a buffalo and a porcupine, with thick hides that fetched good money from traders who came through twice a year. The ranch house was small but solid, built from local stone and imported metal panels. Daniel had spent the last 3 weeks fixing it up, painting the walls, replacing broken furniture, and making sure everything looked presentable. Today was the day. After 2 years of letters and video calls, Lucy Hayes was finally arriving from Earth. His hand shook a little as he checked his reflection in the cracked mirror by the door. He looked older than his 32 years, with sun-damaged skin and calluses on every finger. Would she be disappointed when she saw him in person? Daniel walked to the communications terminal and checked the message again. The monthly supply ship would land at the mesa 5 miles north of his ranch in approximately 4 hours. Lucy would be on that ship, along with supplies, mail, and whatever news the colonial administration thought the frontier settlers needed to know. He had met Lucy through the Colonial Matchmaking Service, a program designed to bring more settlers to remote worlds like New Sonora. At first, he had been skeptical about the whole thing. Finding love through a computer system seemed cold and mechanical. But Lucy's first letter had changed his mind. She wrote about growing up near the ocean on Earth, about loving old books and classical music, about wanting to see the stars up close instead of through a telescope. Her words had a warmth that made him smile, something he had not done much since his former partner died in a mining accident 3 years ago. They exchanged messages every week, then every day. The video calls were awkward at first, with the signal delay making conversation difficult, but they learned to work around it. She had a laugh that made her whole face light up, and she never seemed bothered by his rough appearance or simple way of talking. Daniel grabbed his jacket and headed outside to check on the thornbacks one more time. The creatures were valuable, but they were also dangerous if spooked. Their quills could punch through metal and their kicks could break bones. He had learned to move slowly around them and speak in low, calm tones. As he walked through the pens, he thought about how he would explain all of this to Lucy. Would she be afraid of the thornbacks? Would she hate the isolation and the hard work? He pushed those thoughts away and focused on the tasks at hand. The ranch sat in what the colonial maps called a strategic location, though Daniel had never understood why until recently. The valley was close to something called the Disputed Territories, where human colonists and the native Kresh had drawn an invisible line neither side was supposed to cross. The Kresh were a warrior species, tall and covered in scales that changed color with their moods. They had lived on New Sonora for thousands of years before humans arrived, and they were not happy about sharing their world. Daniel had encountered the Kresh a few times during his years on the ranch. Once, a hunting party had come through his property, and he had offered them water and dried meat. They had accepted with stiff formality, and their leader had spoken to him in broken human language. The leader told him that the valley was sacred ground where their ancestors had fought a great battle, but they would allow Daniel to stay, because he treated the land with respect. Daniel had learned a few words of the Kresh language after that, enough to offer proper greetings if they came through again. The relationship between humans and Kresh was complicated. There had been small fights and misunderstandings in the early years of colonization, but eventually both sides agreed to a treaty. Humans would stay in certain areas. Kresh would keep to their traditional lands, and a buffer zone would separate them. Crimson Flats was right on the edge of that buffer zone, which meant Daniel saw Kresh warriors passing through more often than most settlers. He had always been careful to show respect and keep his distance. As the suns dipped below the mountains, Daniel went back inside to grab his gear. He loaded his hover cycle with the emergency kit, water, and a small gift he had made for Lucy. It was a necklace carved from blue stone he had found in the hills, polished smooth over many evenings of careful work. He hoped she would like it, though he worried it might seem primitive compared to the jewelry she could get on Earth. The hover cycle hummed to life, lifting a few inches off the ground on its anti-gravity cushion. Daniel checked the coordinates for the landing site one more time and started the journey north. The ride across the valley was smooth, with the hover cycle gliding over the rough terrain without any trouble. Daniel watched the stars come out one by one as the sky darkened. New Sonora had a clear atmosphere, and the view of the galaxy was spectacular on nights like this. He thought about all the letters Lucy had sent, all the dreams they had shared about building a life together on the frontier. She wanted to start a garden and maybe raise some of the smaller animals that traders brought through. He wanted to expand the ranch and maybe hire some help, so they would have time to explore the surrounding wilderness together. The mesa came into view, a flat-topped mountain rising from the valley floor like a natural landing pad. Daniel could see the beacon lights marking the safe landing zone, flashing in a steady rhythm that guided ships down through the atmosphere. He parked his hover cycle at the base of the mesa and climbed the steep path to the top. His heart was pounding, and he could not tell if it was from the climb or from nervousness about finally meeting Lucy in person. He reached the top and stood at the edge of the landing zone, looking up at the sky and waiting for the ship to appear. That was when he noticed something was wrong. The ship was coming in too fast. Daniel could see the trail of fire behind it as it screamed through the atmosphere, and that was not normal for a controlled landing. The civilian transport ships always came down slowly and carefully, taking their time to match velocity with the planet's rotation. This ship was falling like a rock, its engines firing in desperate bursts to slow down. The distress beacon was active too, flashing red instead of the calm blue of a routine approach. Daniel felt his stomach drop as he realized something had gone terribly wrong up in orbit. The ship hit the mesa hard, its landing gear barely deploying in time to keep it from flipping over. Metal screamed and tore as the vessel skidded across the landing zone, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. One of the engines exploded in a ball of orange flame, and Daniel threw himself flat to avoid the shrapnel flying overhead. The ship finally came to rest at the far edge of the landing pad, tilted at a dangerous angle and leaking fluids from a dozen ruptures in its hull. The silence that followed was broken only by the creaking of stressed metal and the hiss of escaping gases. Daniel scrambled to his feet and ran toward the wreck, pulling his emergency respirator over his face in case the air was contaminated. The side hatch of the ship blew open with a bang, and a figure stumbled out, coughing and struggling to stay upright. It was a woman in a torn military uniform, her dark hair matted with blood from a cut on her forehead. She carried a small device in one hand and a pistol in the other, and her eyes were wild with adrenaline and pain. Daniel recognized her face despite the injuries and the shock of seeing her in military gear instead of civilian clothes. It was Lucy Hayes, but not the Lucy he had been expecting. Before he could say anything, the ship's core exploded. The blast threw both of them off their feet and sent a mushroom cloud of fire and smoke rolling into the night sky. Daniel felt the heat wash over him even from 30 feet away, and his ears rang from the concussion. He crawled over to where Lucy had fallen and helped her sit up. She was still clutching the device and the pistol, her knuckles white with the effort. When she saw his face, something like relief flashed in her eyes, followed immediately by fear. The ground began to shake. At first, Daniel thought it was an aftershock from the explosion, but then he heard the sound of thunder rolling across the valley. Except it was not thunder. It was the sound of hundreds of feet striking the earth in unison. The sound of heavy animals carrying armed riders. The sound of war coming toward them at full speed. Daniel turned toward the noise and felt his blood turn cold. From every canyon and ravine surrounding the mesa, Kresh warriors were emerging on their massive riding beasts. The creatures the Kresh rode were called storm lizards, and they were the size of elephants with scales like armor plating. Each one carried a warrior in full battle gear, with spears and energy weapons that glowed in the darkness. Daniel counted quickly and stopped when he reached 100. There were at least 4 times that many, maybe more, all converging on the mesa from different directions. They moved with practiced coordination, forming a circle around the landing zone that cut off any possibility of escape. The lead rider carried a banner that marked him as a war chief, and the scars on his visible scales suggested he had seen many battles. Lucy tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Daniel caught her and helped her sit back down, his mind racing to understand what was happening. The Kresh had never assembled a force this large near human territory, at least not since the treaty was signed 5 years ago. Something had changed, and the timing of the ship crash and their arrival could not be a coincidence. He looked at Lucy's military uniform and the device she was protecting so carefully, and pieces began to fall into place. The Kresh warriors completed their encirclement and stopped, their storm lizards snorting and pawing at the ground. The war chief urged his mount forward and stopped 20 feet away from Daniel and Lucy. He was enormous, even by Kresh standards, with dark blue scales that shifted to red along the edges. His armor was decorated with symbols Daniel did not recognize, and his eyes were the color of molten gold. When he spoke, his voice was like rocks grinding together, and his human words were heavily accented but clear. The war chief said that humans had broken the treaty and brought war machines to sacred ground. He said the explosion was proof of human aggression and preparation for invasion. He pointed at Lucy's uniform and the burning wreckage of the ship as evidence. Daniel tried to interrupt, to explain that this was a mistake and that the ship had been damaged. But the war chief held up one massive hand for silence. The gesture was not threatening, but it carried absolute authority that made Daniel stop talking. Daniel took a deep breath and tried to remember the Kresh words he had learned. He spoke slowly and carefully, using the formal greeting that the hunting party had taught him 3 years ago. He explained that he was just a rancher who lived in the valley, that the woman with him was supposed to be his bride, that they meant no harm to the Kresh or their sacred places. The war chief listened without expression, his golden eyes moving between Daniel and Lucy as if measuring their worth. Lucy finally managed to stand, leaning heavily on Daniel for support. She spoke in Kresh language too, though her accent was different from Daniel's rough pronunciation. She said that she carried important information about a threat to both humans and Kresh, that the ship had been attacked by enemies neither species had faced before, that they needed to speak with the Kresh Council immediately. Her voice was urgent and her words tumbled out quickly, but the war chief showed no reaction. After a long silence, the war chief made a decision. He said that Daniel and Lucy would be taken to the tribal gathering grounds for judgment. The council of elders would hear their words and decide if they spoke truth or lies. If they spoke truth, they would be treated with honor. If they lied, they would face Kresh justice for violating the treaty and bringing violence to sacred land. The war chief made it clear that resistance would mean immediate death, but cooperation would be rewarded with fair treatment. Daniel looked at Lucy and saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. They had no choice. Even if they tried to run, there was nowhere to go and no way to outrun 400 mounted warriors. He nodded to the war chief and helped Lucy down from the mesa. Warriors came forward with a medical kit and began treating her injuries, their movements efficient but not gentle. Other warriors searched them for weapons and found only Daniel's utility knife and Lucy's pistol. The war chief examined the pistol and handed it to a subordinate for safekeeping. 2 storm lizards were brought forward, already saddled for prisoners. Daniel and Lucy were helped onto the creatures, with their hands bound loosely in front of them. The bindings were more symbolic than restrictive, a way of showing they were under guard without causing unnecessary pain. Daniel had never been this close to a storm lizard before, and the sheer size and power of the animal was intimidating. The creature's scales were warm to the touch and it made a low rumbling sound that he felt through his entire body. The war chief gave an order in the Kresh language, and the entire formation began to move. They headed south away from Daniel's ranch and deeper into Kresh territory. Daniel twisted in his saddle to look back at the burning wreck of the ship, the flames still visible against the dark sky. Everything had gone wrong in a matter of minutes. He had been waiting for his bride, dreaming of a simple life together on the frontier, and instead he was being taken prisoner by 400 warriors who thought he was part of an invasion force. Lucy met his eyes across the distance between their mounts. Even injured and exhausted, she gave him a small nod that seemed to say they would figure this out together. Daniel tried to return the gesture with more confidence than he felt. The journey to the Kresh gathering grounds would take days, and he had no idea what would happen when they arrived. All he knew was that his quiet life as a rancher had just ended, and whatever came next would change everything. The first day of travel was brutal. The Kresh warriors set a pace that seemed designed to test their prisoners' endurance, moving through the rough terrain without stopping for rest or water. Daniel's storm lizard followed the formation automatically, responding to commands from the warrior riding beside him. Lucy rode a few animals behind, surrounded by guards who watched her with obvious suspicion. The military uniform she wore marked her as something dangerous in their eyes, and several warriors kept their weapons ready as if expecting her to attack at any moment. By midday, Daniel's entire body ached from the unfamiliar riding position. Storm lizards moved differently than the hover cycle he was used to. With a rolling gait that required constant balance adjustments, the twin suns beat down mercilessly, and his water supply had been taken along with everything else from his pockets. One of the younger warriors seemed to notice his discomfort and offered a drinking bladder without being asked. Daniel accepted gratefully and tried to thank the warrior in Kresh language. The warrior's scales shifted to a lighter blue color, which Daniel remembered was a sign of curiosity or mild pleasure. They stopped briefly in the afternoon to rest the storm lizards. Daniel was helped down from his mount, his legs nearly giving out when his feet hit the ground. Lucy was brought over to sit beside him, and for the first time since the crash they had a chance to talk quietly. The guard stayed close but allowed them some privacy, perhaps understanding that prisoners needed to speak with each other. Lucy looked worse than before, with dark circles under her eyes and dried blood still crusting her hairline. The crash medics had cleaned and bandaged her injuries, but she clearly needed proper rest and treatment. Daniel asked her what was really happening and why she had come on a military ship instead of the civilian transport. Lucy closed her eyes for a moment before answering. She explained that she was a lieutenant commander in Colonial Naval Intelligence, assigned to investigate reports of unusual activity in this sector. The matchmaking service correspondence had been real, she insisted, looking at him with desperate sincerity. Every letter she wrote had been true, but her superiors had discovered that someone was feeding false information to the Kresh, trying to convince them that humans were preparing for war. They needed an agent in place to investigate, and Lucy had volunteered because she was already scheduled to come to New Sonora. The mission had been simple in theory. Lucy was supposed to arrive on a civilian ship, settle in as Daniel's wife, and quietly gather intelligence about who was manipulating the Kresh. But everything went wrong when her ship was intercepted by an unknown force in orbit. They had attacked without warning, using weapons technology that did not match any known species in the sector. Lucy's ship barely escaped, and the captain made the decision to crash land rather than risk leading the attackers to other colonies. The device she had been protecting was a data core containing evidence of a much larger threat. Daniel listened in silence, trying to process everything. He felt betrayed and confused, but he could also see the fear in Lucy's eyes. She had not wanted things to happen this way, and she was clearly terrified of what might come next. He asked her about the threat she had mentioned to the war chief, and she pulled the data core from an inner pocket of her uniform. The device was small, about the size of a deck of cards, but apparently it contained information worth dying to protect. Lucy explained that human intelligence had intercepted communications from an empire called the Vraxians, a species that wanted to expand into this sector by any means necessary. The Vraxian strategy was clever and ruthless. Instead of attacking humans and Kresh directly, they were trying to trick both species into fighting each other. They had agents spreading false information, faking incidents, and planting evidence to make it look like each side was preparing for war. Once humans and Kresh had weakened each other through conflict, the Vraxians would sweep in and claim all the colony worlds for themselves. The crash of Lucy's ship and the assembly of 400 Kresh warriors was exactly what the Vraxians wanted to happen. Every misunderstanding brought the trap closer to springing shut. Daniel understood now why the war chief had seemed so certain about human aggression. If the Vraxians had been feeding the Kresh false intelligence for months or even years, then a military ship exploding on sacred ground would seem like proof of invasion. He looked at the warriors around them and realized they were not acting out of cruelty or hatred. They thought they were defending their home from an existential threat. The tragedy was that humans and Kresh were being played against each other by an enemy neither side had even met yet. The break ended too soon, and they were back on the storm lizards for another long stretch of riding. As the afternoon wore into evening, Daniel found himself riding closer to the young warrior who had offered him water. The warrior's scales were mostly green with patterns of yellow, and he wore simpler armor than the veterans. Daniel took a chance and tried to start a conversation using his limited Kresh vocabulary. He asked the warrior's name and learned it was Zenik. The warrior seemed surprised that a human knew any Kresh words at all, and his scales rippled with colors Daniel could not interpret. Over the next hours, Daniel and Zenik exchanged simple phrases and gestures. Daniel taught Zenik how to say a few words in human language, and Zenik corrected Daniel's terrible pronunciation of Kresh terms. It was slow and awkward, but it was communication. Other warriors noticed and watched with varying degrees of interest and disapproval. The war chief glanced back once but said nothing, apparently willing to allow this small interaction as long as it did not slow down the formation. When they stopped to make camp for the night, Daniel shared some dried food from his emergency pack that the guards had missed during their initial search. Zenik accepted it cautiously and tried a small piece, his face going through a series of expressions as he processed the unfamiliar taste. Several other young warriors drifted over to see what was happening, and soon Daniel was teaching them human words for different foods while they taught him Kresh terms. It was a tiny moment of connection in the middle of a dangerous situation, but it felt important. Lucy watched from where she sat under guard, too exhausted to join in but seeming to understand what Daniel was doing. Building relationships one person at a time was the only tool they had right now. If they could show even a few Kresh warriors that humans were not monsters, it might make a difference when they faced the Council of Elders. The guards around Lucy were older and more suspicious, but even they seemed less hostile after watching the younger warriors interact with Daniel. The second day of travel took them deeper into Kresh territory than any human had gone in years. The landscape changed from open valleys to dense forests of alien trees with purple bark and silver leaves. Strange animals called out from the undergrowth, and Daniel saw his first wild storm lizard, a massive bull that watched the formation pass with ancient eyes. The Kresh warriors seemed more relaxed here, as if being in their heartland eased some invisible tension they carried near human lands. Daniel spent every break trying to talk with Lucy, learning more about the Vraxian threat and her mission. She showed him files on the data core, translated into human language that detailed the Vraxian battle plan. They had been planning this invasion for decades, carefully studying human and Kresh psychology to find the best ways to turn the two species against each other. The files included transcripts of Vraxian agents discussing how primitive and emotional both humans and Kresh were, how easy it would be to manipulate them into destroying each other. The contempt in those transcripts made Daniel's anger burn cold and steady. By the third day, Daniel's body had adapted to the constant riding, and his conversations with Zenik had evolved into something resembling friendship. The young warrior told him about growing up in the Kresh clans, learning to fight and hunt and honor the old ways. Zenik asked questions about human culture too, curious about things like families and farming and whether humans really came from a world covered mostly in water. The other young warriors listened in, adding their own questions and observations. It became clear that most of them had never actually met a human before this journey. Lucy used the time to memorize everything she could about Kresh culture and language. Despite her injuries and exhaustion, she paid attention to every detail of how the warriors interacted with each other. She explained to Daniel during one brief conversation that understanding their honor codes and social structures would be crucial when they faced the council. The Kresh valued directness and courage, she said, so they would need to present their evidence clearly and be prepared to face harsh judgment without flinching. On the evening of the third day, they crested a ridge and saw their destination. The Kresh city was built into the side of a massive canyon, with structures carved directly from the red stone walls. It was beautiful and ancient, a testament to generations of craftsmanship and cultural continuity. Lights glowed in windows carved into the rock face, and Daniel could see figures moving along terraces and walkways that zigzagged up the canyon walls. The city was much larger than he had imagined, probably home to thousands of Kresh. Morning came too quickly. Daniel had barely slept in the small stone room they gave him, his mind racing with worry about the coming judgment. The room was simple but not uncomfortable, with a sleeping platform covered in woven materials and a small window that looked out over the canyon. He could hear the sounds of the city waking up, voices calling in Kresh language and the rumble of storm lizards moving through the streets. Someone brought him water in a bowl of grain porridge that tasted strange but filling. He ate slowly, knowing he would need his strength for whatever lay ahead. Guards came for him when the twin suns were fully above the horizon. They were polite but firm, escorting him through corridors carved into the living rock of the canyon wall. The stone was covered in intricate carvings that told stories Daniel could not read, images of battles and hunts and celebrations that stretched back through countless generations. Other creche passed them in the halls, civilians going about their daily business who stopped to stare at the human prisoner with obvious curiosity. Children peeked around corners and whispered to each other before being shooed away by their parents. The council chamber was a vast circular room at the heart of the city, with a domed ceiling that rose at least 50 feet overhead. Natural light streamed in through openings carved to catch the morning sun, and the walls were decorated with banners representing different clans and family groups. A semicircle of stone seats rose in tiers along one wall, and these were occupied by the Council of Elders. Daniel counted 15 creche sitting in judgment, their scales showing the faded colors of advanced age and their eyes sharp with intelligence and experience. Lucy was already there, standing in the center of the chamber with guards on either side. She had been given clean clothes, simple garments in creche style that replaced her torn military uniform. Her injuries had been treated more thoroughly, and though she still looked exhausted, she stood straight and met the eyes of the elders without flinching. When Daniel was brought to stand beside her, she gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. The war chief stood to one side of the chamber with several other military leaders, while Zenek and the younger warriors watched from positions along the walls. The center seat in the council tier was occupied by an ancient creche, whose scales had faded to almost white with age. She wore robes of deep red, and her bearing radiated authority despite her obvious physical frailty. When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong and clear. She introduced herself as Matriarch Senna, leader of the council and keeper of the old traditions. She said that Daniel and Lucy stood accused of bringing war to sacred ground and violating the treaty between creche and humans. The evidence seemed clear, she continued, but the council would hear their words before passing judgment. War Chief Takan stepped forward to present the case against them. He described finding the human military ship destroyed on the mesa in Crimson Flats, a place where the ancestors of his clan had fought and died in ancient times. He pointed to Lucy's uniform, which had been brought as evidence, and noted the military insignia and rank. He showed fragments of weapons and equipment recovered from the crash site, including items that could only have come from a warship. Everything pointed to human forces mobilizing for an attack on creche territory, exactly as their sources had been warning them for months. Daniel listened to the accusations and felt a cold weight in his stomach. Presented this way, without context or explanation, the evidence was damning. He could see several elders nodding in agreement with Takan's words, their scales shifting to angry reds and oranges. Lucy remained motionless beside him, waiting for her turn to speak. The matriarch allowed Takan to finish his presentation completely before holding up one hand for silence. She then turned her golden eyes to Lucy and invited her to speak in her own defense. Lucy stepped forward and began speaking in creche language. Her accent was better than Daniel's rough attempts, though still clearly marked as foreign. She thanked the council for the opportunity to be heard, and acknowledged that the evidence looked suspicious from their perspective. Then she began to explain about the Vraxians and their manipulation of both species. She spoke clearly and methodically, presenting facts without emotional appeals or dramatic gestures. The elders listened in silence, though their scales flickered through various colors that Daniel was learning to read as signs of skepticism and doubt. When Lucy mentioned the data core, several elders leaned forward with interest. She asked permission to present the evidence it contained, and after a brief consultation among the council members, Matriarch Senna granted the request. Lucy activated the device and holographic images appeared in the center of the chamber. The images showed Vraxian communications intercepted by human intelligence, translated into both human and creche languages. The messages discussed the plan to trigger a war between the two species, including specific details about false flag operations and planted evidence. One communication particularly caught the council's attention. It was from a Vraxian agent embedded somewhere in creche territory, reporting on the success of spreading rumors about human military buildup. The agent described which clan leaders were most susceptible to the propaganda and recommended additional actions to increase fear and anger toward humans. The message ended with cold calculations about how many creche and human casualties would be needed to weaken both sides sufficiently for invasion. The chamber erupted in angry discussion. Several elders shouted questions at Lucy, demanding to know if the communications were genuine or clever human forgeries. Taken challenged the evidence too, pointing out that humans could easily fake transmissions to support their story. Lucy remained calm under the barrage, answering each question as clearly as she could. She explained the technical details of how the communications were intercepted and verified, using terms that the more technologically inclined elders seemed to understand. She admitted that some suspicion was reasonable, but asked them to consider whether the evidence fit with other strange events they might have noticed. Recently, Daniel saw his chance to contribute and asked permission to speak. Matriarch Senna granted it with a gesture. He told the council about his years living peacefully in Crimson Flats, about his encounters with creche hunting parties, and the respect he tried to show for their traditions. He explained that he was just a rancher trying to make a living, that he had been waiting for Lucy to arrive as his bride through the matchmaking service, not as a military operative. His life had been quiet and boring until the ship crashed, and he had no reason to want war with the creche. Several younger warriors, including Zenik, spoke up to support Daniel's character. They described his willingness to share food and learn their language during the journey. One elder who had been part of the hunting party that visited Daniel's ranch years ago confirmed that the human had shown proper respect and hospitality. It was a small thing, but it seemed to make some impression on the council. Not all humans were warmongers, these testimonies suggested, and perhaps there was more complexity to the situation than simple invasion plans. The debate continued for hours, with different council members raising objections or asking for clarification. Lucy pulled up more files from the data core, showing patrol routes of suspected Vraxian scout ships and analysis of their likely invasion timeline. She explained that human colonial defense was already on high alert and preparing for the threat, but they had been slow to realize that the creche were being targeted with the same manipulation tactics. The explosion of her ship on the mesa had been the worst possible timing, playing directly into the Vraxian plans to spark a conflict. Matriarch Senna finally called for order, and the chamber fell silent. She conferred quietly with the elders on either side of her, their heads bent together in serious discussion. Daniel's heart pounded as he watched them deliberate. Everything depended on whether they believed the evidence or dismissed it as elaborate human deception. Lucy stood beside him, her hands clasped behind her back and her jaw tight with tension. The wait felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The matriarch spoke at last, and her words carried the weight of final judgment. She said the evidence was troubling and deserved serious consideration. However, the council was divided on whether to believe it. The stakes were too high to make a decision based on incomplete information and the words of potential enemies. Therefore, she proposed a test. Daniel and Lucy would be held as honored guests, not prisoners, for 7 days. During that time, they could present additional evidence and try to prove their claims. The council would also send scouts to investigate suspicious activity in the border regions. If the Vraxian invasion fleet appeared within 7 days, as Lucy's intelligence predicted, the creche would know the humans had spoken truth. At that point, the council would consider an alliance to face the common threat. If 7 days passed with no sign of Vraxian forces, then Daniel and Lucy would be judged as spies who brought false evidence to hide human aggression. The judgment for such deception would be severe. Matriarch Senna made clear that this was not mercy but pragmatism. The cost of believing a lie was war with humans, but the cost of dismissing truth was destruction by the Vraxians. The next morning, Daniel and Lucy began their work in earnest. They had 7 days to prove that the Vraxian threat was real, and every hour counted. Lucy focused on the technical side, studying the data core and trying to establish communications with human forces. Daniel took a different approach, using his practical skills to build relationships with the creche who were willing to talk. They split up most of the time, each playing to their strengths, but they made sure to meet in the evenings to share what they had learned. Daniel's first breakthrough came in an unexpected way. While exploring the city under the watchful eyes of his guards, he passed through the agricultural terraces where the creche grew their food. The terraces were carved into the canyon walls in a series of steps, each one irrigated by a clever system of channels that brought water from the river below. Daniel stopped to admire the engineering and noticed something troubling. Several plants in the nearest terrace showed signs of disease, their leaves spotted with black marks and their stems wilted despite adequate water. He asked his guard if he could examine the plants more closely. The guard was suspicious at first, but eventually agreed, perhaps curious about what the human found so interesting. Daniel knelt beside the infected plants and carefully turned over leaves to look at the undersides. He recognized the pattern from a similar blight that had affected his thornback feed crops 2 years ago. The disease was caused by a fungus that thrived in humid conditions, and if left untreated, it would spread through the entire crop within weeks. An older creche was working in the adjacent terrace, and she came over to see what the human was doing. Daniel tried to explain the problem using his limited vocabulary, supplemented with gestures and drawings in the dirt. The old farmer was skeptical but interested enough to listen. Daniel described how he had dealt with the fungus on his ranch, using a combination of removing infected plants, improving air circulation, and treating the soil with compounds made from local minerals. The farmer asked sharp questions, testing whether Daniel really knew what he was talking about. Word spread quickly through the agricultural community that a human was claiming to understand creche crops. Within a few hours, Daniel found himself surrounded by farmers and gardeners who wanted to hear his ideas. He spent the entire day in the terraces, examining plants and soil conditions, offering suggestions in his broken creche language. Some of the farmers were openly hostile, believing that no human could understand their traditional methods. Others were more pragmatic, willing to try anything that might save their crops from the spreading blight. By evening, Daniel had gained grudging respect from at least a few of the agricultural elders. They agreed to test his methods on a small section of the infected terrace. If his treatment worked, they would consider expanding it to other areas. It was a small victory, but an important one. Daniel was showing the creche that humans had useful knowledge to share, that cooperation could benefit both species. When he returned to their quarters that night, exhausted and covered in dirt, Lucy greeted him with genuine excitement about his progress. Lucy's work had been more technically challenging. She needed to establish communication with human forces to coordinate a response to the Vraxian threat, but the creche city was deep in a canyon with high stone walls that blocked most signals. The communications equipment available to her was also limited, consisting mainly of whatever the guards would allow her to access. She explained her problem to Zenik, who had been assigned as one of their primary guards due to his growing friendship with Daniel. Zenik listened carefully and then made a suggestion. The creche had their own communication systems, based on principles that were different from human technology. Their devices used what they called resonance waves, which could pass through solid rock more easily than human radio signals. If Lucy could adapt her equipment to interface with creche systems, she might be able to boost her signal enough to reach human outposts. It would require cooperation from creche technicians, which meant convincing more of them that helping was in everyone's best interest. Over the next 2 days, Lucy worked alongside 3 young creche engineers who were fascinated by human technology and willing to collaborate despite the political tensions. They were curious about how human computers processed information and how human ships navigated through space. Lucy shared what she could without revealing military secrets, and the engineers taught her about resonance wave theory in return. The language barrier created constant challenges, but they developed a shared vocabulary of technical terms and used sketches to communicate complex ideas. Daniel continued his work in the agricultural terraces, and his suggestions began showing positive results. The fungus stopped spreading in the treated areas and new growth appeared healthy and strong. The farmers who had been most skeptical started asking more questions about human farming methods. Daniel told them about crop rotation, pest management, and soil conservation techniques that humans had developed over thousands of years of agriculture. Some methods were not applicable to creche crops, but others could be adapted with good results. In the evenings, Daniel and Lucy shared their experiences. They were both exhausted but cautiously optimistic. Lucy explained that she was getting close to establishing a communications link, though the equipment was temperamental, and the signal would be weak. Daniel talked about how the farmers were starting to see him as a problem solver rather than an enemy. Small moments of connection were adding up to something larger, though whether it would be enough remained uncertain. On the 4th day, Lucy finally achieved a breakthrough. The modified communication array came online, powered by a combination of human and creche technology that should not have worked together, but somehow did. The signal was weak and prone to interference, but it reached a human monitoring station on the edge of the sector. Lucy sent a compressed data burst containing her most recent intelligence on the Vraxian fleet movements and requested immediate response confirmation. The wait for a reply felt endless. Lucy sat by the communication device for hours, making minor adjustments and hoping the signal would hold. Daniel brought her food and water, encouraging her to rest for a few minutes, but she refused to leave the equipment unattended. Zenik and the Kresh engineers stayed too, invested in seeing whether their collaborative effort would succeed. Just before midnight, the device crackled to life with an incoming transmission. The response came from a human defense outpost, and the news was grave. The officer on duty reported that 3 human colony worlds on the far side of the sector had gone silent within the past week. Relief ships sent to investigate had found the colonies devastated, with signs of attack by unknown forces using advanced weapons. The attacking ships had fled before human reinforcements could arrive, but preliminary analysis of the damage suggested technology consistent with the Vraxian signatures Lucy had provided in her intelligence files. Lucy recorded the entire transmission and immediately requested an audience with the Council of Elders. It was the middle of the night, but this could not wait. Matriarch Senna agreed to convene an emergency session, and within an hour the council chamber was filled with sleepy but alert elders. Lucy played the transmission for them, translated into Kresh language by Zenik and the engineers who had helped build the communication array. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The evidence could no longer be dismissed as human fabrication. 3 colonies had been attacked, exactly as Lucy's intelligence had predicted. The pattern matched what the Vraxian communications described as the first phase of invasion. War Chief Taken stood and addressed the council, his earlier skepticism replaced by grim acceptance. He said that Kresh scouts had returned that day with reports of unknown ships detected near the border regions, ships that matched no known configurations. The pieces were coming together and the picture was terrifying. Matriarch Senna called for a recess to allow the council to deliberate. Daniel and Lucy were escorted back to their quarters while the elders debated through the night. Neither of them could sleep, knowing that everything hinged on what the council decided. If the Kresh agreed to work with humans, there might be a chance to coordinate defenses and face the Vraxian threat together. If they remained suspicious and divided, both species would face the invasion separately and likely fall. Morning came with summons back to the council chamber. The elders looked haggard from the long night of debate, but their expressions were resolute. Matriarch Senna announced the council's decision. They believed that the Vraxian threat was real and immediate. The evidence from both human and Kresh sources confirmed that an invasion force was approaching. The question now was not whether to act but how to respond. The traditional enmity between Kresh and humans seemed foolish in the face of extinction. However, Matriarch Senna continued, believing the threat was real did not automatically mean trusting humans. Many council members remained suspicious of human intentions and worried about being manipulated into a disadvantageous alliance. What was needed was proof that humans and Kresh could work together effectively, that cooperation would benefit both species, rather than leaving the Kresh vulnerable to human exploitation later. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Lucy coordinated with Human Military Command through the modified communication array, providing tactical assessments and requesting the deployment of Marine forces to the Joint Operations Staging Area. The human side was skeptical at first, with several officers questioning whether the Kresh could be trusted or whether this was an elaborate trap. Lucy's reputation as an intelligence officer carried weight, though, and eventually Admiral Peterson authorized the deployment with strict conditions and backup plans in case things went wrong. Daniel worked with War Chief Taken and Zenik to prepare the Kresh warriors for cooperation with humans. Most of the warriors had never seen humans up close before this crisis, and their understanding of human capabilities was based more on rumor than fact. Taken assembled his fighters in the main training ground, a wide plaza carved into the canyon floor, and invited Daniel to speak. Daniel felt ridiculous standing in front of 200 armored Kresh warriors, but he did his best to explain basic human military tactics and communication protocols. The warriors listened with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Some clearly thought humans were weak and unreliable compared to Kresh strength and honor. Others were more open-minded, willing to reserve judgment until they saw humans in action. Daniel used examples from history, telling them about human battles and the tactics that had worked against overwhelming odds. He emphasized that humans relied on adaptability and teamwork, rather than individual strength, traits that could complement Kresh warrior traditions if both sides were willing to learn from each other. Zenik helped translate the more complex ideas and added his own observations about human behavior during their journey to the city. He told the other warriors about how Daniel had shared food and tried to learn their language despite being a prisoner. Small gestures of respect had made a difference, Zenik argued, and the same principle should guide their interactions with human Marines. Not everyone was convinced, but at least they were listening and asking questions instead of dismissing everything out of hand. The human Marines arrived at the staging area on the second day, transported by 2 dropships that landed in a clearing several miles from the Kresh city. Lucy and Daniel traveled out to meet them, accompanied by Takin and a Kresh honor guard. The meeting was tense from the start. The Marines were battle-hardened veterans who had fought in several colonial conflicts, and they viewed the Kresh with obvious suspicion. The Kresh warriors responded with equal wariness, hands resting on weapons as they sized up the humans. The Marine commander was a woman named Helen Porter, a career officer with gray hair and scars that suggested extensive combat experience. She greeted Lucy with professional courtesy, and Daniel with barely concealed confusion about why a civilian rancher was involved in a military operation. Lucy explained Daniel's role as cultural liaison quickly, and then moved on to the tactical briefing. There was no time for lengthy explanations or team-building exercises. They had to learn to work together immediately, or the operation would fail. The briefing took place in a temporary command center set up between the 2 encampments. Lucy presented what they knew about the Vraxian probe ship, using data compiled from both human sensors and Kresh scouts. The probe was hiding in an asteroid field in the outer system, using its stealth systems to avoid detection while gathering intelligence on planetary defenses. The asteroid field would interfere with long-range weapons, meaning the joint force would need to get close for an engagement. That meant coordinated tactics between Kresh Storm Lizard cavalry and human armored vehicles. Commander Porter raised immediate objections about the feasibility of coordinating such different combat styles. How could slow-moving biological mounts possibly keep pace with armored transports? How would they maintain secure communications across language barriers? What would prevent friendly fire incidents when both sides were using weapons in close proximity? These were all valid concerns, and Lucy did not have perfect answers for any of them. What she had was necessity, and the hope that smart people on both sides could figure it out. Takin listened to Porter's objections through Zenik's translation, and then responded with his own concerns. How could Kresh warriors trust human weapons that might malfunction or be turned against them? How would command decisions be made when the battle situation changed rapidly? What assurance did he have that human forces would not abandon the field if things went badly? The fundamental issue was lack of trust, built up over years of separation and occasional conflict. No amount of tactical planning could completely overcome that deficit. Daniel suggested starting with small combined teams rather than trying to coordinate 200 warriors at once. Pair human Marines with Kresh warriors in groups of 10. Let them practice basic maneuvers together and build familiarity before the actual operation. It would not create perfect understanding, but it might create enough connection that they would fight to protect each other when combat started. Porter and Takin both looked skeptical, but agreed to try the approach since no one had better ideas. The joint training exercises revealed both promise and problems. Some pairings worked surprisingly well, with humans and Kresh finding ways to communicate through gestures and simple shared vocabulary. A Kresh warrior named Draven formed an effective partnership with a Marine called Jake Harris, the 2 developing hand signals for common tactical situations. Other pairings were disasters, with cultural misunderstandings leading to arguments and near fights that had to be broken up by commanders. Lucy worked herself to exhaustion coordinating the logistics, establishing communication protocols and mediating disputes. She barely slept running on stimulants and determination. Daniel spent hours moving between groups, explaining human behavior to confused Kresh and Kresh customs to frustrated Marines. He found himself becoming something like a translator not just of words but of entire worldviews. helping each side understand why the other did things that seemed strange or counterproductive. On the evening before the operation, new intelligence arrived that changed everything. Kresh long-range scouts detected massive gravitational distortions at the edge of the star system, signatures consistent with a large fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel. The Vraxian invasion force had arrived earlier than expected, and the probe ship in the asteroid field was no longer just an intelligence-gathering mission. It was advance reconnaissance for an invasion fleet of unprecedented size. The news sent both camps into emergency action. Lucy immediately contacted Admiral Peterson with updated intelligence, while Taken sent messengers racing back to the Kresh city with warnings. The situation had escalated from a limited joint operation to a desperate defensive battle. The probe ship was still a valuable target, but now it was also urgently necessary to eliminate it before it could guide the invasion fleet to optimal attack positions. Every hour the probe remained operational meant more time for the Vraxians to map defenses and identify weak points. Commander Porter assembled her Marines and gave them the updated mission parameters. The joint force would move on the probe ship immediately, traveling through the night to reach the asteroid field by dawn. Speed was now as important as coordination. They had to destroy or capture the probe before the main fleet could use its data. Porter's voice was grim as she explained that this might be the opening battle of a war none of them were ready for, but ready or not, it was happening. Taken addressed his warriors with similar gravity. He spoke of duty and honor, of defending their world against invaders who saw both Kresh and humans as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. The old feuds between their peoples seemed petty now in the face of extinction. He reminded them that they were warriors of ancient clans who had never surrendered to any enemy, and today they would prove that truth again. The warriors responded with a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls, a sound both terrifying and inspiring. Daniel checked his equipment one more time, making sure he had everything he might need. He was not a soldier and had never expected to be in combat, but there was no backing out now. Lucy found him sitting alone outside the command center and sat down beside him. They did not say much, just sat together in comfortable silence as the stars came out overhead. Daniel thought about his ranch in Crimson Flats, wondering if he would ever see it again. Lucy thought about all the decisions that had led her to this moment. The mission that had brought her to New Sonora and the man sitting beside her, who had become so much more than the pen pal she had expected. The combined force moved out at midnight, a strange convoy of Kresh storm lizards and human armored vehicles, traveling together through the alien wilderness. The coordination was imperfect, with frequent stops to keep the formation together. But they were moving, and that was something. Daniel rode with Zenik and several other Kresh warriors, while Lucy traveled in Commander Porter's command vehicle, coordinating communications between both groups. The night was clear and cold, and the twin moons of New Sonora provided enough light to see the rough terrain ahead. As they traveled, Daniel noticed something unexpected happening. The human Marines and Kresh warriors were starting to talk to each other. The attack began at dawn with Kresh scouts moving silently into the asteroid field on their storm lizards. Daniel watched from the command position as the massive creatures picked their way between tumbling rocks with surprising grace. The scouts used hand signals to communicate with each other, avoiding electronic transmissions that might alert the probe ship to their presence. Each warrior carried sensor equipment provided by Lucy that could detect the subtle energy signatures the Vraxian stealth systems could not completely hide. 2 hours passed in tense silence. Commander Porter paced in her command vehicle while War Chief Taken stood motionless, watching the asteroid field with predatory focus. Lucy monitored multiple data feeds simultaneously, coordinating information from human sensors and Kresh scouts. Daniel stayed close to Zenik, ready to help translate any urgent communications. The waiting was almost worse than action would be. Every minute stretched thin with anticipation and fear. The signal came suddenly. One of the Kresh scouts had detected an energy signature deep in the asteroid field, hidden in the shadow of a massive rock that was slowly tumbling through space. Lucy confirmed the signature matched Vraxian technology profiles from her intelligence data. The probe ship was exactly where they hoped it would be, using the asteroid's bulk to shield itself from long-range detection. Now came the dangerous part of getting close enough to attack without being detected themselves. The main assault force began moving into position. Kresh warriors advanced through the asteroid field in groups of 20, using the rocks for cover while converging on the probe ship from multiple directions. Human Marines followed in smaller powered armor suits that could maneuver in the low-gravity environment, providing fire support and carrying heavier weapons. The coordination was better than expected, with both groups adapting to each other's movements and maintaining formation despite the challenging terrain. Daniel rode with Zenek's group, clinging to the Storm Lizard's saddle and trying not to think about how many ways this could go wrong. The asteroids were massive up close, some the size of buildings and others larger than entire city blocks. They tumbled slowly in their orbits, occasionally colliding with each other in impacts that sent smaller fragments spinning away. One wrong move could put them in the path of a collision that would crush warriors and animals instantly. The probe ship came into visual range, and Daniel got his first look at Vraxian technology. The vessel was smaller than he expected, maybe twice the size of the ship Lucy had crashed in, but its design was alien and unsettling. The hull was covered in what looked like scales or plates that shifted colors to match the surrounding asteroids. Weapon ports were visible along its flanks, and a cluster of sensor arrays extended from the nose like the antennae of some enormous insect. The ship looked organic despite being made of metal and composites, as if the Vraxians designed their technology to mimic living things. Warchief Taken gave the signal to attack. Kresh warriors charged from multiple directions simultaneously, their storm lizards leaping between asteroids with powerful leg muscles. Energy weapons fired, bright lances of light that illuminated the darkness and struck the probe ship's shields. The shields flared and held, absorbing the initial barrage, but they were not designed to handle attacks from so many directions at once. Human Marines added their firepower, missiles, and projectile weapons, striking weak points that Lucy had identified from the intelligence data. The probe ship responded with shocking speed. Automated defense turrets emerged from hidden ports and began firing at the attacking forces. Several Kresh warriors were hit in the first seconds, their shields overloading and armor cracking under the concentrated fire. A human marine suit lost power and went tumbling through space, the soldier inside struggling to activate emergency thrusters. Daniel saw one storm lizard take a direct hit and explode in a spray of blood and bone, its rider thrown clear but injured and spinning helplessly. The battle descended into chaos. Both sides were fighting at close range among the tumbling asteroids, with the probe ship using the terrain to its advantage, just as effectively as the attackers. Vraxian weapons were more advanced than either human or Kresh technology, but they were designed for ship-to-ship combat rather than this kind of desperate close-quarters engagement. The probe ship tried to break free and escape into open space, but Kresh warriors blocked every escape route while human Marines pounded its engines with sustained fire. Daniel found himself in the middle of the fighting almost by accident. His group had been moving to flank the probe ship when a defense turret targeted them. Zenek's storm lizard jumped to avoid the fire, and Daniel nearly fell off before catching himself. He saw a human Marine pinned down behind a small asteroid, unable to move without exposing himself to the turret. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed an energy spear from a wounded Kresh warrior and threw it at the turret with all his strength. The spear flew true in the low gravity, striking the turret's base and shorting out its systems. The Marine took advantage of the opening to reposition and fired a rocket that destroyed the turret completely. The Marine waved acknowledgement to Daniel, a simple gesture that somehow felt enormously significant. A human rancher and a professional soldier had just saved each other's lives, working together without hesitation despite being strangers from different worlds. The turning point came when a Kresh warrior named Draven executed a suicidal attack that changed the entire battle. He urged his storm lizard directly at the probe ship's main engine, ignoring the defensive fire that tore through his armor. His mount was killed beneath him, but momentum carried Draven forward. He crashed into the engine assembly and detonated a plasma charge he had been carrying, sacrificing himself to cripple the ship. The explosion was blinding even in the vastness of space, and when it cleared, the probe ship was venting atmosphere and drifting powerless. Warchief Taken immediately ordered warriors to board the damaged vessel before it could self-destruct. Human Marines joined the boarding action, cutting through the hull with plasma torches and breaching the interior. Daniel followed with Zenek, moving through corridors that were too small for Kresh warriors but sized perfectly for humans. The interior of the ship was a maze of organic-looking technology and strange architecture. Warning lights flashed and alarms wailed as the ship's automated systems tried to assess damage and initiate emergency protocols. They found the first Vraxian in what appeared to be a control room. The alien was smaller than a human with 4 arms and a body covered in chitinous plates. Its head was dominated by compound eyes that reflected light like gemstones. The Vraxian was wounded and trapped under fallen equipment, but it was still alive. When it saw the combined force of humans and Kresh entering the room, its eyes widened with what might have been shock or fear. It made sounds that were translated by Lucy's equipment as demands to know why prey species were working together. Lucy arrived with Commander Porter and began interrogating the Vraxian with translation software. The alien was contemptuous at first, insisting that the alliance was temporary and would collapse once humans and Kresh understood how incompatible they were. But as Lucy showed the creature evidence of the coordinated attack and the casualties both species had taken to capture this ship, something changed in its demeanor. It began to realize that the intelligence reports were wrong, that humans and Kresh were capable of cooperation that went beyond simple survival instinct. The interrogation revealed crucial information about the Vraxian invasion plan. The main fleet was larger than anyone had feared, with enough firepower to overwhelm human and Kresh defenses separately, but the invasion timeline was built around the assumption that the two species would be fighting each other, rather than coordinating defense. The Vraxian commander had allocated minimal forces to this sector, because intelligence indicated it would be easy to conquer, once internal conflicts weakened both sides. If humans and Kresh actually worked together, the invasion plan would need complete revision. War Chief Taken listened to the translation with grim satisfaction. The Vraxians had underestimated their prey, and that mistake would cost them. He gave orders to secure the probe ship and extract all intelligence data before scuttling the vessel. Human and Kresh forces worked together to download files, remove technology samples, and take the surviving Vraxian into custody. The coordination was not perfect, but it was effective. They were learning to operate as a single force rather than two separate militaries. The return journey from the asteroid field was slower than the approach. They carried wounded from both species, and several warriors and Marines had died in the battle. Daniel helped tend to injuries using the medical knowledge he had learned living on the frontier. He found himself working alongside Kresh healers who used different techniques but shared the same goal of keeping their people alive. Language barriers faded when the work was urgent and the need was clear. Lucy compiled a comprehensive report during the trip back, documenting everything they had learned from the captured probe ship. The intelligence was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it showed the Vraxian plans relied on assumptions that were now proven false. The Vraxian invasion fleet arrived in force exactly 1 week after the alliance was signed. Long-range sensors detected 3 massive carrier ships entering orbit, each one dwarfing the largest human or Kresh vessels. The carriers were accompanied by dozens of smaller warships and hundreds of automated drone fighters that swarmed around the capital ships like insects. Admiral Peterson called it the largest invasion force he had seen in 30 years of military service. And even War Chief Taken admitted the sight was intimidating. The combined human and Kresh command staff gathered in an emergency session to plan their defense. They were badly outnumbered and outgunned, facing technology more advanced than anything either species possessed. Direct confrontation would be suicide, so they needed strategy and terrain advantages. Lucy studied the invasion patterns from the intelligence gathered from the probe ship and noticed something important. The Vraxians were conducting detailed scans of the planet before committing ground forces, looking for population centers and military installations to target first. Daniel had an idea. His ranch in Crimson Flats sat in a valley with unusual geological properties that created natural interference with most scanning systems. It was why he had been able to live there relatively unnoticed for 3 years despite being close to Kresh territory. If they could make the valley look like a significant military installation using false signals and decoy equipment, they might be able to lure a portion of the Vraxian fleet into a trap. The narrow canyon walls would limit the effectiveness of the carrier's long-range weapons and force the drones into confined spaces where coordinated ground fire would be more effective. Commander Porter immediately saw the potential but also the risks. They would be using the combined forces as bait, gambling everything on a single ambush. If the Vraxians saw through the deception, or if the trap failed to disable enough of their forces, the defenders would be caught in the open and destroyed. Lucy supported Daniel's plan, adding technical details about how to generate false signals that would read as weapons batteries and shield generators. The Vraxians relied heavily on their sensor data, she explained, and if that data told them Crimson Flats was a key defensive position, they would commit forces to neutralize it. Matriarch Senna listened to the debate and made a decision that surprised many of the military commanders. She said they should proceed with Daniel's plan because it represented the kind of creative thinking that gave weaker forces a chance against stronger ones. The Kresh had won many battles throughout their history by using terrain and unconventional tactics rather than matching strength against strength. If the human rancher saw a way to turn his home into a battlefield that favored the defenders, they should trust his knowledge of the land. The next 48 hours were a frantic race against time. 200 human Marines and 200 Kresh warriors were deployed to Crimson Flats under the joint command of Commander Porter and War Chief Taken. Lucy coordinated the placement of sensor spoofing equipment and false signal generators, while Daniel guided both forces through the valley, showing them defensive positions and explaining the terrain features. His ranch house became the command center, with communication equipment set up in what had been his living room just weeks ago. The Kresh warriors were impressed by the valley, despite the circumstances. They recognized it as the sacred ground where their ancestors had fought, and several of the older warriors offered prayers at ancient markers carved into the canyon walls. The human Marines were more practical, fortifying positions and setting up weapon emplacements with practiced efficiency. Daniel moved between both groups, helping coordinate the defense and making sure everyone understood the plan. The false signals would draw the Vraxians into the valley, and once they were committed, the trap would spring from all sides. The thornbacks in Daniel's pens were released into the wild before the battle. He stood watching them run across the valley floor toward the hills, feeling a strange sadness at seeing his livelihood disappear. Lucy found him there and took his hand without saying anything. They both knew the ranch would probably be destroyed in the coming fight, but it seemed worth the sacrifice if the plan worked. Daniel had built a life here in solitude, but now he was fighting to protect something larger than his personal comfort. The Vraxian force arrived on the third day. 3 carrier ships descended through the atmosphere in formation, their massive hulls blocking out the sun as they approached Crimson Flats. Clouds of drone fighters deployed ahead of them, autonomous killing machines programmed to eliminate any resistance. The drones were sleek and fast, each one armed with energy weapons and smart missiles. Human and Kresh forces watched from hidden positions as the enemy filled the sky, and more than one warrior whispered prayers or made peace with the possibility of death. Daniel was in the command center with Lucy, Taken, and Porter when the carriers entered the valley's scanning dead zone. For a few crucial seconds, the Vraxian ships were operating on outdated sensor data, unaware of the true situation. That was when Taken gave the order to attack. Energy weapons fired from concealed positions in the canyon walls, targeting the carrier's shield generators and engine assemblies. Human artillery launched missiles programmed with targeting data Lucy had extracted from the probe ship. Kresh warriors on storm lizards charged the landing drone formations before they could organize defensive patterns. The surprise was complete, but the Vraxians adapted quickly. The carrier's automated defense systems engaged, filling the air with suppressing fire that forced attackers to take cover. 2 of the carriers began retreating toward open sky, while the third attempted to land and deploy ground forces. Drone fighters swarmed toward the canyon walls where the heaviest fire was coming from, their weapons stitching lines of destruction across the rock face. Several weapon emplacements were destroyed in the first minutes, and casualties mounted on both sides. Daniel watched the battle unfold on multiple displays, coordinating information between human and Kresh units. He saw Jake Harris and Draven's younger brother fighting side by side, covering each other as they advanced on a landed drone cluster. He saw Commander Porter directing fire from a forward position, her command presence holding the line when Marines started to falter under the intense counterattack. He saw War Chief Taken lead a charge directly at one of the carriers, his warriors following him without hesitation into fire so heavy, it seemed impossible anyone could survive. Lucy was managing the technical side of the battle, directing both human ships and Kresh aerial units against the carriers. She had identified the command and control nodes that coordinated the drone fighters, and if they could disable those nodes, the drones would lose their coordination and become much easier to defeat. The problem was that the nodes were heavily shielded and protected by layers of automated defenses. It would take a direct assault team to reach them, and the casualties would be catastrophic. Zenik volunteered to lead the assault team before anyone else could speak. He gathered 20 volunteers, a mix of young Kresh warriors and human marines who had become friends during training and the probe ship operation. Daniel tried to object, but Zenik stopped him with a gesture. This was what warriors did, Zenik said. They sacrificed themselves so others could live. The young Kresh had learned from humans about improvisation and from his own people about honor, and now he would combine both traditions to do what was necessary. The assault team launched from concealed positions using a combination of storm lizard speed and human jetpacks. They crossed the open ground in seconds, taking fire from every direction but moving too fast for the automated systems to track effectively. Half the team was killed or wounded before they reached the first carrier. But the survivors breached the hull and fought their way inside. Daniel watched their progress through helmet cameras and vital signs monitors, feeling helpless as friends died one by one in the metal corridors of the enemy ship. Zenik reached the command node with only 3 others still alive. The node was a massive crystalline structure pulsing with energy, protected by a final layer of defensive drones. The assault team fought through the drones with desperate fury, using their last ammunition and reserves of strength. 2 more died in that final push, but Zenik and a human marine named Carl Peterson reached the node itself. They planted plasma charges on the structure's base and activated the timers, then tried to retreat before the explosion. The command node detonated with a force that shook the entire carrier. The explosion cascaded through the ship's systems, overloading circuits and disabling critical functions. The carrier began to fall, its engines losing power and its superstructure buckling under the stress. Zenik and Carl were caught in the blast, their life signs flattering on Daniel's display. Lucy gripped his shoulder as tears ran down his face, but there was no time to grieve. The carrier was crashing into the valley floor, and everyone needed to clear the impact zone. The carrier hit the ground like a falling mountain. The impact sent shockwaves across the valley and threw up clouds of dust that obscured visibility for precious minutes. When the dust cleared, the massive ship was split open like a broken egg, its interior exposed and burning. More importantly,